Mazda spent years developing the RX-8, refining it, making it cleaner and more efficient. They brought back the rotary engine to prove it still had a place in the modern world, and then they killed it. Not on purpose, but because they had to. So how did a car with this much heritage, this much potential, turn into the reason the rotary disappeared? Let's go back to the early 2000s. Mazda had a vision. They wanted to bring the rotary back, but they wanted to do it right this time. The RX-7 was incredible, a masterpiece of engineering and driving dynamics, but it was also too hardcore, too expensive, too niche. It was a car for the purists, the track day warriors, the people who didn't care about comfort or practicality. Mazda wanted the RX-8 to be different. They wanted a rotary for everyone, a car that kept the spirit of the rotary, that screaming, high-revving personality, but wrapped it in something more accessible, more livable, more practical. 4 seats, real doors, a smoother, more refined engine, a car you could actually daily drive without hating your life, and on paper, it sounded great. The Renesas engine, Mazda's new rotary design, revved to 9,000 RPM. The chassis had perfect 50-50 weight distribution. It looked sharp, aggressive, but elegant, and it was affordable, priced to compete with the 350Z and S2000. The hype was real. Rotary fans were excited. Mazda enthusiasts were excited. This was the return everyone had been waiting for. The rotary was back, and it was supposed to be better than ever. But the reality, the actual experience of owning and driving an RX-8 was something else entirely. To understand why the RX-8 failed so spectacularly, you need to understand what came before it. The RX-7, especially the FD generation, was everything a sports car should be. Lightweight, turbocharged, twin-turbo sequential setup that screamed when you got on it. Beautiful curves, pop-up headlights, handling that made it a driver's car in the purest sense. It wasn't perfect. Rotaries had always been quirky. They burned oil by design. They had apex seal issues. They ran hot, but the RX-7 embraced those flaws. It was a car for enthusiasts who understood what they were getting into, who were willing to deal with the maintenance and the quirks because the driving experience was worth it. But Mazda killed the RX-7 in 2002. Emissions regulations were getting tighter. The market for hardcore sports cars was shrinking, production costs were high, and sales volumes were low. It didn't make business sense anymore. But Mazda wasn't ready to let the rotary die. The rotary was their identity, their engineering pride, the thing that made them different from every other manufacturer. So they went back to the drawing board. They developed the Renesas, a new naturally aspirated rotary that was supposed to solve all the old problems. Cleaner emissions, better fuel economy, more reliability. They moved the exhaust ports to the side of the housing instead of the periphery, which reduced overlap and unburned fuel. On paper, it was a smarter, more efficient rotary. In reality, it was the beginning of the end. Because here's where it all fell apart. The apex seals, the little metal strips that seal the combustion chamber in a rotary engine, those were always the weak point, and in the Renesas, they became a catastrophic failure point. The side exhaust ports, the ones that were supposed to make everything better, they created hot spots. They caused carbon buildup. They made the apex seals wear out even faster than they did in the old rotaries. And when those seals failed, the engine was done. No compression, no power, no fixing it without a full rebuild or replacement. And it didn't take long. 40,000 miles, 60,000 miles, maybe 80,000 if you were lucky, and babied it. That's not acceptable for a modern car. That's a ticking time bomb. Mazda dealerships were flooded with warranty claims. Engines were being replaced left and right. Customers who bought the RX-8 thinking they were getting a fun, reliable sports car were stuck with repair bills and rental cars. The story spread fast. Forums filled up with tales of engine failures, of compression loss, of Mazda refusing warranty coverage because the owner didn't keep up with oil changes, even though the car burned a quart every 1,000 miles. It was a disaster, and it killed the RX-8's reputation before it even had a chance. And then there was the power, or the lack of it. The RX-8 made 238 horsepower when it launched, and that dropped to 232 in later years after Mazda had to detune it slightly for emissions. For context, the FDR-X7 made 255 horsepower with its twin turbos, and that was 10 years earlier. The 350Z was making 287 horsepower. The S2000 was making 240 but weighed 400 pounds less. The RX-8 wasn't just down on power compared to its predecessor, it was down on power compared to everything it competed against. And it was heavier than the RX-7 too, around 3,000 pounds, which isn't terrible, but combined with less power, it meant the RX-8 felt slow. It didn't pull like a sports car should. You had to wring it out, keep it above 7,000 RPM just to feel any urgency, and even then, it wasn't fast. It was just loud. And if you got the automatic, forget it. The automatic RX-8 made even less power, around 212 horsepower, because the engine had to be tuned differently to handle the lower red line of the automatic transmission. It was a sports car that felt slower than a Civic Si, and that's not hyperbole. People were genuinely disappointed. The Rotary was supposed to be special, supposed to feel different, but the RX-8 just felt underpowered and underwhelming. But wait, it gets better. The fuel economy. Remember how Mazda promised the Renesas would be more efficient? Yeah, that didn't happen. The RX-8 got maybe 16 to 18 miles per gallon in real-world driving. City driving, worse. Highway driving if you kept your foot out of it, maybe 22 if the planets aligned. This was a car making Civic-level horsepower, but drinking gas like a V8 muscle car, and burning oil on top of that. By design, you had to check the oil every time you filled up with gas, and if you didn't, if you let it run low, the engine would grenade itself. It was all the downsides of owning a sports car with none of the performance to justify it. And the compromises? The RX-8 was supposed to be practical, remember? 4 seats. Suicide doors that opened wide to give access to the back. Sounds great, except the rear seats were useless for anyone over 5 feet tall. You could maybe fit kids back there, maybe a couple of grocery bags, but that's it. And those suicide doors, they looked cool, sure, but they added weight and complexity. You couldn't open the rear doors without opening the front doors first, which made getting in and out awkward. They had no structural pillar, which meant Mazda had to reinforce the chassis elsewhere, adding even more weight. The RX-8 was trying to be a practical sports car, but it ended up being neither practical nor particularly sporty. Enthusiasts didn't want the compromises, and regular buyers didn't want a Rotary with all its quirks and maintenance headaches. Let's talk about the maintenance nightmare, because owning an RX-8 wasn't just about dealing with apex seal failures, it was a constant battle. You had to top up the oil every 1,000 miles, because the engine burned it by design. If you didn't, you risked cooking the engine. Short trips, those would flood the engine. The Rotary needed to get up to temperature and stay there, so if you were just driving to the grocery store and back, the engine would load up with fuel, foul the plugs, and refuse to start. You'd have to pull the fuel pump fuse and crank it over and over to clear it out. Coil packs failed constantly, catalytic converters clogged and needed replacing. Carbon buildup was a constant issue, requiring either aggressive Italian tune-ups, running the car hard at high RPM to burn it off, or full teardowns to manually clean everything out. And if you wanted to keep the apex seals alive as long as possible, you had to pre-mix your fuel. That's right, shade tree engineering became standard practice for RX-8 owners. You would add 2-stroke oil to every tank of gas just to give the seals extra lubrication, because the factory oil metering system wasn't enough. And even then, it was just delaying the inevitable. You had to do compression tests constantly to monitor the engine's health, because there was no other way to know if the seals were starting to fail. And good luck finding a mechanic who actually understood rotaries. Outside of a handful of specialists, most shops wouldn't touch them. They didn't know how they worked, didn't want to deal with them, and couldn't diagnose issues properly. So you either learned to wrench on it yourself, or you paid through the nose to ship it to a Rotary specialist hours away. And here's the real kicker for enthusiasts. The RX-8 had 0 tuning potential. None. The Renesas was maxed out from the factory. There was no headroom, no way to extract more power without spending absurd amounts of money. Turbo kits existed, sure, but they cost anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000, and they turned the engine into an even bigger grenade. The block couldn't handle boost. The apex seals that were already fragile would fail even faster under pressure. You'd make 300, maybe 350 horsepower for a few months before the whole thing exploded, and then you were looking at a full engine rebuild or replacement. There was no strong aftermarket like the RX-7 had, no big turbo culture, no reliable 400 to 500 horsepower builds that people could chase. The tuning community looked at the RX-8, realized it was a dead end, and moved on. Compare that to the RX-7. That car had endless potential. Single turbo conversions were common, reliable, and could make serious power. People were building 400, 500, even 600 horsepower RX-7s that still ran strong. The aftermarket was massive. Companies like HKS, Greddy, and BorgWarner all had solutions. The community was passionate and knowledgeable. The RX-8 had none of that. It offered 230 horsepower in bankruptcy if you tried to go further. And so the most common modification for the RX-8 became engine swaps, LS swaps, 2JZ swaps, K-series swaps. People were ripping out the Rotary, the entire reason the car existed, and replacing it with a piston engine just to have something reliable and tunable. That's how bad it was. The tuning community completely abandoned the platform. The money, the effort, the passion, all of it went to 350Zs and S2000S instead. Cars that could actually handle modifications and deliver results. Sales reflected all of this. The RX-8 started strong in 2003, moving around 23,000 units in its first year in the US. People were curious, excited about the Rotary's return. But by 2005, sales had dropped to under 10,000. By 2008, they were barely moving 3,000 units a year. The word was out. The engine failed too often. The power wasn't there. The fuel economy was terrible. And the ownership experience was a nightmare. Resale values plummeted. You could buy a used RX-8 for less than a comparable Miata, and the Miata was slower, less prestigious, and had too fewer seats. That's how little people wanted them. Mazda's reputation took a hit too. The unreliable label stuck, and it hurt sales across their entire lineup. People started questioning whether Mazda could build reliable sports cars at all. In 2012, Mazda quietly discontinued the RX-8. No big announcement, no farewell edition, no celebration of the Rotary's legacy. It just died, and with it, the Rotary engine died too. There's been no Rotary-powered production car since. Mazda has teased concepts like the RX Vision, beautiful renderings of what a modern Rotary sports car could look like, but they're just that, renderings, dreams. The reality is that the RX-8 killed any chance of the Rotary coming back in a serious way. It proved that the technology, at least in its current form, wasn't viable. It couldn't meet emission standards without sacrificing reliability. It couldn't deliver the performance modern buyers expected, and it couldn't justify the maintenance headaches and costs. The RX-8 didn't just fail as a car, it killed a 40+ year legacy, and that's the real tragedy here. The lesson is clear: you can't compromise a niche product for mass appeal. The RX-7 worked because it embraced what it was, a flawed, quirky, high-maintenance machine that delivered an experience you couldn't get anywhere else. The RX-8 tried to hide those flaws, tried to make the Rotary something it wasn't, and it backfired spectacularly. Sometimes engineers need to accept when a technology has reached its limits, when pushing forward means compromising too much. The RX-8 could have been something special if Mazda had made it lighter, given it more power, accepted the quirks instead of trying to engineer them away. But they didn't, and now the Rotary is gone, dead because of this one car, and that's something we'll never get back.